So I find this, I just find Casemiro, the whole thing, just such an interesting discussion. And it's been so interesting for years because okay, so we'll start with here where Ancelotti is like, okay, you stay put, you're going to play this role. I can't really mask you by putting you higher up the pitch because I need you for defensive security. Also, we're playing a high line. Also, the wing backs are going to be having space behind them. We kind of need you there. We need you in zone 14. We need you to mop it up. And we can't have you out of position. And it's funny when you think about the way Zidane used him, and Zidane's whole thing was like, I need you there as a destroyer because first of all, when I played for Real Madrid, we sucked so bad defensively that we needed Makaleli to just be like Superman and just be everywhere. And so when he left, everything just went to hell. And we need somebody like that. So here, this is you now. I'm a manager. We need you. And my defense is going to be suspect for a while. But here's the catch. I can't have you there all the time because you suck with the ball at your feet. So you have to go higher up the pitch. But then that has its dominoes because that means people are out of position. And then was the whole thing during the three-peat, right? It was entertaining as hell. We had a blast. The three-peat was a dynastic team. The ratings were through the roof. The entertainment value was through the roof. Our attack was awesome. And it was a lot of just basically Modric was doing a lot of defensive things by himself and then attacking because the defensive midfielder Casemiro was in the box and no one else was in position. So then Varane had to be Superman. Ramos had to be Superman. And obviously we know like over Zidane's last year and a half of being a manager here before he left the second time, the defensive problems were fixed in a lot of ways. Our defense improved. But it's just weird because like Casemiro was probably the best ball winner in Europe, and you put him there, and he's good at so many things. And I don't know, like I've been back and forth on the cost benefit analysis of him. There are times where I think it's probably net negative in certain games anyway, but there are even like with this, but there are a lot of games where he's a net positive. There's no denying that. It is interesting though. We're basically, and Matt and I have discussed this. I don't know if you were on those podcasts, but like Real Madrid is the last team, really, last like quote unquote elite big club team to be clinging on to the Casemiro figure. You look, I was watching highlights of Bayern today, and I was looking at Kimmich's role overall at Bayern, and when he's that holding player, it's just a completely different way that defensive midfielders are used around Europe at big clubs, right? I just find the discussion really interesting. I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to just stop talking for a sec.
Yeah, so I think the comparison point is quite interesting, right? Because there was this whole debate after Xabi Alonso left, right? And we didn't win any trophies in the 14-15 season. And the entire discussion was like, look at all these teams. It's impossible to win without a classic defensive midfielder. And almost like instantly after we said that, all of like the great dynasties besides Real Madrid just didn't have a classic destroyer in their side. And I'm not necessarily saying that you could just go without it, right? Like you can play like David Silva on defensive midfield and get away with it. Like I don't think that's the case. It's right. It's a thing where it's like you just have to be good enough to where the defensive responsibilities are distributed between lots of players, right? You don't need to be this incredible player who is the guy cleaning everything up. You just need to be good enough defensively, right? And other players will help you out. Team structure becomes more of a thing, right? And then if you are like kind of a ball winner, right, you have to do different things. Like if Conte's role, right, once Sarri came and then Tuchel is like super, super interesting. He was never a classic destroyer. Like he never positioned himself on ball like he was a pivot in possession, but he was more of a double pivot player. And then Sarri comes in, he's like, Conte, I need you to become an interior because it's just limiting otherwise. Right? His back to goal play was a real weakness. And then when Tuchel comes in, there was discussion, is that going to change? And not really. It's kind of the same thing. You kind of have it's a little bit different because Mason Mount also plays as a forward, but a lot of times there's midfield three shifts when he shifts off, and Conte essentially just plays in the right half space. And what we learned from all of that was, okay, his back to goal play might be suspect, but when he turns and faces and he's in really fast combinations, he's actually really, really good. And he has a lot of on-ball value. I think we're getting to a point where if you're going to be a player who provides primarily all of their value against the ball, right, as a central midfielder, you either need to be adequate enough on ball to where like, okay, whatever, we'll live with it, or you have to be good enough at a certain thing to where a manager can adjust and put you in a particular situation, like where Tuchel has essentially optimized Conte's on-ball game to the maximum, right? And then obviously Jorginho's there to start play, and either Kovacic or Mount will help out on either side of him. And just with Casemiro is like the guys like there isn't a defensive midfielder with like bigger trade-offs or bigger question marks on how to use him, right? Because the thing he's best at offensively, besides long passes, is being a runner into the box. But doing that takes away from his defense, and it's really interesting. And I think it is interesting to then look at other teams they're like, okay, this is not for us, right? With more positional play coaches, coming to the fore, with build up from the back being really important versus pressing, they've just decided that the trade-offs aren't actually worth it, right? And we'll deal with it differently. And so, yeah, I don't think it means anything for Real Madrid as long as Casemiro is here, as long as he's in his prime, because he's an indisputed starter. But when we move on from him, it's going to be a pertinent squad building question, because it's not like we're just going to go and find another Casemiro somewhere else, right? It can't be the case where if Casemiro is not in the side, we can't be a good defensive unit. And so, yeah, Real Madrid are kind of stuck in a weird time in that respect, but we've been able to make it work so far. Zidane found some interesting ways to make it work, and it ended up obviously being a positive for us. But those trade-offs, a lot of modern managers aren't interested in that anymore. Like Pep's not interested, Tuchel's not interested, even Jurgen Klopp's not really interested. Or, what he did was he put the playmaking load on the fullbacks. He did something super unique, but I think Henderson is also underrated on the ball. Same with Fabinho. And what happened? They ended up bringing in Thiago, right? Because they wanted him to play that role. Real Madrid is in a weird space. And I'm only slightly surprised that Ancelotti hasn't gone the same way, because he's actually that type of guy. He was the guy that played Kroos in defensive midfield.
That's not to interject. I mean, that's just what I was going to say is like, it's interesting to note that not only Ancelotti, but Lopetegui, who's also kind of this possession-oriented coach, also opted, like Casemiro was a nailed-on starter. Same thing for Carlo Ancelotti.
And I think it's because you can't drop him, though. It's because of his name and the way he cemented his place. I think that's part of it.
Well, his defensive ability, but also like literally everyone on the team loves him. Like they loved him. Ronaldo respected him. Like I've not seen other players.
Well, coaches love him too. I mean,
I love him.
Yeah. We all saw the
happiest guy in the world.
How he studies Wisecout, although it backfired against him. What was the next game? Man City, where the article came out how he studies Wisecout and goes in the he goes in his hyperbaric chamber and watches Wisecout clips. Yeah.
And, Matt wrote an article about it. And then he had like one of the worst games.
He did an interview with Sid Lowe. He did an interview with Sid Lowe where he talked about how he like in his free time he watches all the old games. He even watches games from like China and like different leagues and like studies them. And when he's doing his recovery in the hyperbaric chambers and Normatec boots and stuff like that, he's watching it and like just studying. And so coaches like love him for that. And he sets a great example. And he's a leader. Like we've seen that. We know that. And he's a charismatic guy, so I think all that stuff translates. It's just interesting. Like you would think coaches that have this belief system and build this system of play, it just Casemiro's so far from it. Yeah, he transcends it. So he's
the only guy in the world who can take out a ref clean and then like mock giving
that was amazing.
A card.
That was the best moment of the match. That was amazing.
I feel like he knew exactly what he did at that moment, and he just played it off as his joke. Brilliant. Like he just fooled the ref.
And it was Hernandez, so that makes it all the more better too.
Oh man, but yeah, I mean, just seems it would be interesting, right? Like would Pep Guardiola, like let's say like they sign him, right? Like what would happen? Because I would imagine he can't be benched, right? It's one hand is generational defensive talent, but also I think like he's just a real presence on the field, and it just gives players a peace of mind, right? We talk about Casemiro giving players freedom, which I don't feel is always accurate, right? Because when, for example, the Zidane era, when Modric and Kroos have to drop so deep, like I wouldn't call that freedom. But then when Marcelo like gives this players tribune, he writes this piece and he says like, I don't care, about defending, and I can just go forward because Casemiro is going to save my life, right? And in a big team context, as long as you have the pieces around him, you can make it work, because all you have to do is get to the final third, and then whatever. It might be slow, or you might have to put in a lot of crosses. But when you have like Ronaldo, or if you have a Lewandowski, like I can easily see the rationale being like, who cares, right? Because the biggest question for big teams now is how to control defensive transition. We've seen City suffer in the Champions League, and we've come to a weird place now where there was a very brief period where we thought you didn't need an anchor man at all, right? Like Pep was trying some crazy stuff, pressing from the front was just teams got better at playing through it. And then you're like, okay, we actually do need someone who's talented in defensive transition, who's a really good ball winner, but they also need to be good on the ball. And I think that's where you see a lot of double pivots coming into play, where it's about sharing the load, essentially, right? Like where you can cover for weaknesses, right, that aren't massive weaknesses, by just sharing the load, having a really good system, like, for example, Tuchel does, to where Jorginho is not good at covering space. Like, I know he's the UEFA Player of the Year or whatever, but he has serious weaknesses in defensive transition, and the entire defensive structure masks that. He has Conte on the other side. He has Kovacic on the other side. Chelsea can press. And then Conte's ball playing abilities when he's facing back to goals covered by the fact that, so it's that type of thing. And I just think that's where it's trending. With Casemiro, it's just a question of defensively he's too good, because you can't mask everything he does on the ball like that. Like we had Kroos and Modric, and the way to mask it was to throw him upfield, right? So it's a bit of an extreme case that, maybe he's the one guy you make an exception for. If Ancelotti did it, if Lopetegui did it, maybe he's that unique and he kind of transcends. But it would be interesting to take like maybe the ones who value it the most, like a Pep. I wonder what happens with a Casemiro. Tuchel probably finds a way and he does something, because that's just been the story at Chelsea.
There are workarounds, and it's certainly contextual game to game, right? If you're facing a low block that's not going to press the anchor, it's not as bad to cope with, right? Like there are going to be games where teams will just go into the defensive low block and will rely on the counterattack, and Casemiro is way more useful in that situation. Now, look, even cities or even Barcelona, when Busquets at his peak, part of the blueprint in stifling that team's build-up was to man mark Busquets, and even Busquets would. I don't know necessarily he would struggle, but certainly that would stifle their build-up to a pretty good extent. So it really depends. And if you're facing Ajax, if you're facing Manchester City, Ajax of a few years ago, the one that knocked us out, those are the games where it gets magnified, right? And the discussion of like this weird era that we're in, where we have him in the team, and could we shift without him? Usually we only play without him if it's a necessity, if like he's injured or suspended. And over the years, in cases where we've had to do that, from what I remember, it's been better when we shift to a double pivot rather than an anchor role. So like Kovacic in double pivot with basically any partner that we had was typically good. But Kovacic as a lone anchor or Kroos as a lone anchor didn't work nearly as well, right? So shifting to a double pivot usually has worked better for us, because I don't know if right now in this team, like Modric, I'd say was the one I trust most in that deep role. He's played that with Croatia to an extent. I don't love Fede there. I don't think Fede is the right player for that role, which is weird. You remember that whole thing when Fede first came into the team, and there was that whole summer where everyone was like, Fede is the anchor. Remember that? Do you remember that?
That was annoying. But but see, that's my point with the Kovacic thing, right? Because if you look at Kovacic's ball winning numbers, they're actually really, really good. And I guess people just don't look at him that way, but he's one of the best ball winning central midfielders in the world. He's not tip top. And I think that's why when you put him in an anchor man role, it doesn't really work. But that's what I talk about.
Anchor man role? Is that a term we're going to use? That's the first time I've ever said it like that. Anchor man role. I love that.
It's like a football manager thing. Like there's an anchor man position. But anyway, cool. When you put Kovacic in a double pivot, suddenly, right? Like it's fine, and that's the thing, and that's where Casemiro is like, okay, because we kind of went into, and we're jumping ahead now, but might as well, because this conversation has gone all over the place. But when Asensio comes on, right, it was interesting to me because this time he was on the left. The last game, for like 1 second, he was on the left, and then he just went to the right the entire time. And Ancelotti was like, all right, I didn't like that. Let's put him on the left. Let's do the Di Maria thing. And he got into a lot of left wing type positions, and that meant we had to transition to a double pivot. And that was also like coincided with Casemiro giving the ball away like 90 times in like 10 minutes. Like, that's the other thing with Casemiro, right? So you can talk about, we put it in a double pivot, right, to solve that. It's still a case where maybe that increases his usage, right, even more, because you don't have two players on either side of him. I guess it doesn't make that much of a difference when Fede is always positioned so high up, but that's the thing with Casemiro, right? It's like, I feel like all these traditional adjustments don't work, or I don't know, quote unquote work, but aren't preferred, which is why Zidane did something that no one else does with defensive midfielders, which was just throw them up the pitch and then essentially just turn them into a box runner while still making them the one who makes the most tackles and everything. Like, I've never really seen that before. Like, people talk about Fellaini, but Fellaini was not a defensive midfielder, really. Even with Everton, he was kind of playing as a shadow striker. So he really is, I think, one of the most interesting, unique cases to analyze in for the context of the modern era, because in like 20, 25 years ago, like, there were tons of players like this, not as good, but this type of profile was everywhere, right? But in the modern era, I don't know if you can actually point to another midfielder who is like Casemiro and who has been used like Casemiro in big game teams while also being as good. Like, it'll be one where you kind of just look back 20 years from now and like try to like see like where was he situated then, and then how has that like affected the game onwards? Is he an anomaly, or is that something that kind of sparks a trend because managers might see a generational defensive talent and be like, you know what, I don't care, like, I'll just figure it out.
Yeah, and I'm interested to get your guys' take on the midfield roles of Isco and Valverde in this match, because I actually thought, and it's particularly with Valverde, in the first few minutes of the match, you saw him make like a darting run, a vertical run from the right half space. And I was like thinking to myself, yes, that's Valverde. That's what he does well. He can continue to do that, pick up the ball, get it by the byline, put it in a cross, or do whatever he needs to do, but continue to make those runs because it's really difficult to track. But then as the game wore on, you saw less and less of that. And I felt like Valverde was actually dropping as deep as Isco was to get on the ball at times and try and build up play. And that's not really his game. And I feel like I thought he had some sloppy passes in this one. And I didn't think it was a great game from Fede. And I thought sometimes I wish he'd be a little bit more, like, he's got a great passing range. We talk about Casemiro's Hollywood passes. Like, I think Fede's got a great long ball, and I feel like he doesn't utilize it that often. And some of the passes options he does go for isn't always the right decision. And so I wonder if he's a player whose strengths get magnified when he's playing with Kroos and Modric, or at least one of the two, because then they do the things that he's not necessarily great at, and then he does the things that they're not great at, which is high pressing, high energy, speed, athleticism, and things of that nature. And I think in a match where he's not with those two, at least today, and where Isco wasn't nearly as good as he was against Levante, you kind of see his weaknesses, and he doesn't perform quite as well. And I think on the flip side, Isco, I just felt like he was trying to play like he did versus Levante, but it just wasn't coming off. And Betis did a better job of slowing him down, and whether it be through fouls or just doubling him down. And there were a couple moments where he had some nice pirouettes or like a nice move to duke through a couple guys, but it just he wasn't as omnipresent as he was in the last game, where he was just kind of everywhere, and all his moves were coming off. And today I just thought he was a little bit quieter.
So, first of all, thank you for bringing us back to the game. I think that was a great transition. And it was the natural next topic, too, to talk about the midfield. And I think, Fede's had, like, a generally quiet season. I mean, he had, obviously, a big moment against Levante and stuff. But he had 4 touches more than Isco in this game. But that's also because he played 25 more minutes. And you just didn't notice him as much. And I think so this is an interesting topic, but you got to kind of bring everything into it. It's not just Fede, it's not just Isco, it's kind of the whole thing. And like, I mean, he was part of the reason why Betis weren't able to exploit the space behind Carvajal, because he was always sprinting over to the flank anytime Betis had an attack down there and did well to cover. But I also felt like we could have used him more offensively, because something that he's so good at is making those off-ball runs in the right half space. And we didn't get that much from him today. And I think that would have helped unlock quite a few things. And I think one thing that Betis did do well defensively is, especially early on, they really made sure to man-mark Isco off the ball, and that's smart, because that's something that Levante didn't do. They gave Isco more space, and we had more transition opportunities against Levante than we did in this game. And that's maybe part of the reason Bale wasn't as effective, but we can talk about that in a bit. I think Isco, being the only natural person who can help us progress the ball, puts a lot of burden on his shoulders. And, my mind, when I was watching this game, I was like, we could really use just an extra body in midfield, because the spacing in the build-up phase was quite spread out. And it was really, really like a spread out 4-3-3 in the build-up. And we didn't really have like the tight-knit passing that Kroos and Modric can come over to help provide, because we just weren't playing that way. And I thought about, man, Odegaard would be ideal in a game like this. And I didn't see the bloodbath in that Manchester City game until after our game, when I watched the highlights. I didn't watch the full game. That's a separate discussion, but just looking at the highlights, like, man, what the fuck is this? This is not football. our Arsenal, I don't know how you can be playing that defensive on those goals and be so bad still, and just watching them. Anyways, that's a whole separate discussion. I don't even have the context of the game, but I feel like if there's any game to realize how bad a team is, just by XG.
Did you see the XG?
Stats. Yeah, I saw the XG, the stats, and I saw all 5 goals. Like, it was unbelievable to me what I was watching. And Pep having the balls after the game to be like, man, Arteta's a great manager. You just got to give him time. That's like ultimate, like. Anyways, just Arsenal fans probably hate him after that comment. But anyways, I thought about Odegaard. That's the point I was making. I just felt like we could have used an extra body in midfield to like move between the lines, help with the build-up phase. And because it was all on Isco, like, he just didn't have as effective a game, or maybe that Levante game was almost a bad thing for him in this game, because Betis scattered it out. They're like, okay, well, he did that against Levante. We're gonna make sure that he has bodies on him. And like, Isco did his thing, like, but I also thought he struggled defensively too, which is something that didn't happen against Levante. Like, he got turned by Guido Rodriguez twice in the first half, which led to good sequences for Betis, and then by Nabil Fekir too. He didn't have a bad game, but I just felt like there was an onus on his shoulders in the build-up today that was apparent without Modric and Kroos.
So I think these games, I already was kind of talking about this load that is on Toni Kroos and what he has to manage in this team. And obviously, I think at this point we all respect Toni, but it's, I think, difficult to realize what he carries when he's on the pitch and the amount he does. Because you can have a good player like Isco, who had an okay game, like he was dispossessed 5 times, not getting the missed passes, 85% passing accuracy. I thought he gifted counterattacks. Like, Kroos, especially when playing next to Casemiro in the old scheme where Casemiro is going forward, like, everything is on him, especially when you lost Marcelo and things became a little tougher with Mendy, right? And Ramos got injured as well. And it was just like everything is on Kroos, right? He has to deal with everyone knows that he's going to be the focal point of possession, right? So that scouting that happened with Isco had happened a million years ago with Kroos. So they're like, how can we stop him? How can we deny him getting on the ball, right? He not only has to consistently evade pressure, but he has to control the entire game while someone's always harassing him, make the right decision, the right pass, decide when to increase the pace of play, which is what I thought we really struggled with in the first half. And this is where I was thinking, like, Kroos instills some order, right? Because it's pinging back and forth. And I think you see the effect of it more when he's not there, whereas when he's there, I think you just kind of take it for granted. And I think we saw that today where like Isco was really targeted. He had a tough time in certain sequences. And then a lot fell on Casemiro's shoulder. And we already had the whole discussion about that. And then in turn, right, Fede was asked to do some things on ball that kind of Matt covered that he was a little inconsistent with. And then, generally with Fede, at least with Real Madrid, like the way he's made his impact has been off ball, pinning midfield lines, making runs in behind. I would agree. I'd like to see a little more of that from him, even though I think he could do a little more on ball, which is why I'm, in a double pivot, if he's like the box to box player, I'm fine with it. And, I guess just to kind of round out the thoughts from way back when I was talking about like these balanced players, ones who distribute the load, I kind of type of guy who's not overwhelming on ball quality, but I think good enough compared with like, or paired with good enough defense that, he's that type of guy who fits, I think, modern systems, right? So if you just like slotted him into like Tuchel's side, I could imagine him like actually kind of replicating the Conte thing to a certain degree. Obviously not being as good defensively, but someone who works well at high tempo, right? Quick combinations. Conte makes these runs in behind. That and then yeah, I mean, this is just kind of a random point because there was nowhere else I was going to be able to put this in. But this whole discussion we're having about the anchor and like, I think it's also facilitated by back threes. Like the evolution of back threes has taken off a lot of build-up load on the single pivot, and that's a way of countering it. So I just wanted to add that in. But yeah, I mean, mad respect for Kroos. Like if you didn't respect him, I think this kind of shows what he has to deal with and the level that he plays at game to game. And how I think we really do take it for granted because we just haven't seen ever a player like him in Real Madrid history. I mean, I guess you go back to Di Stefano, but it wasn't exactly the same thing. And then, yeah, with Fede, it wasn't necessarily the best performance, but, it happens. And I would just consider thinking about Fede as how to continue to optimize what he does. And also, like, maybe consider in certain games where we're like, well, Casemiro, maybe the trade-offs are too much. I think Fede can be that type of player who is the one where you could kind of lean on defensively, right, without losing too much on ball. Because I agree with Matt, he does have a passing range, right? He can be better on the ball, even though ultimately I think his off ball is what makes him special. So, yeah, I mean, kind of a mess of thoughts right there, trying to wrap up what I was talking about earlier and then also talk about Fede. But I mean, that's just kind of the rest of my thoughts on the midfield before we talk about Asensio.
Before we jump to Asensio, I actually think we should talk about, I mean, just to go kind of chronological order here, I guess. What did you think of the performance of the wings? And